Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guests today are Jalel Sager, Austin Cappon, and Jonathan Lee, the co-founders of New Sun Road. They're developing cloud-based technology systems designed to distribute clean energy and internet connectivity for off-grid communities around the world. We talk about how New Sun Road originated from a class at UC Berkeley where the founders met each other. The capstone project from that class ultimately led to the evolution of various products that are now able to provide renewable electricity and internet to several communities around the world for the first time in their lives. The founders shared their experiences building New Sun Road with grants for a very long time and how they worked under extremely resource-limited geographical locations in Vietnam and Uganda. What stands out are qualities like grit, resourcefulness, and patience that help them persevere for over 9 years to continue building technologies to make this world a better place for people who don't have basic necessities. This episode is a very good primer for anyone trying to build startups in under-resourced countries. I've known Jalel for a very long time, since we both were building our startups around the same time and used to share some of the frustrations. I wasn't able to keep up with their progress, and I believe I'm going to learn a lot from this conversation, and I really hope you do too. Jalel, Austin, Johnny, welcome to the show. I never had 3 co-founders on my show, like I was saying, and this is the first time I'm doing it. I'm super excited to have you all 3, and let's experiment and talk about New Sun Road. Jalel, I think it makes most sense to begin a conversation to orient the audience on the problem you're solving, what New Sun Road is doing to solve it, and the scope and scale of the business.
Thanks, Naresh. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So New Sun Road is, broadly speaking, solving 2 problems. One is propagation of distributed energy systems for clean technologies, and the other is internet and energy access, especially in developing communities, remote communities. We are in about 20 countries. We have a scope and a mandate to work around the world and to work also these days in the United States. So we're effectively global, and you can find our core products, which all revolve around the control of solar energy systems, usually distributed solar energy systems, sometimes on grid in the United States, but you can find them in Africa, applications like energy access for villages, whether we're talking about Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Malawi. Those countries are places where we have projects. You can find us in telecom systems in Latin America. When you go out to critical stations, whether they're towers, sometimes hubs, you can find our core IoT software products, basically providing real-time data from these systems and allowing their operators to control hundreds to thousands of systems, eventually tens of thousands of systems in a cost-effective way. One of the real challenges of solar over the years has been maintenance, especially when it's in remote areas. You can have a low-cost solar system or something that's has parity with grid extension, but if you can't maintain it, if it dies in 2 or 3 years or you don't have visibility into it, you're going to sour the investment and you're going to slow down the solar revolution that we all want to see come. So we were founded to tackle climate change and equity issues, and we do that by providing real-time views into these systems. As I was mentioning, telecom systems in Central America are something we do a lot of. And then in the US, we do PG&E in California, Pacific Gas and Electric. Their first remote microgrid in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada was done with our controls just this year that came out. So we're solving the problems as we see opportunities. They certainly all begin with climate solutions and inequity solutions for energy, and internet access is something also we're quite strongly involved in via partnerships with Microsoft and others. We believe electricity and internet access are fundamental for populations in the 21st century, and they go hand in hand.
Absolutely, they are. Before we dig deeper into the startup story, tell us the founding story. Who came up with this idea or the problem, and how did you three come together, and roles each of you played? Let's make it fun. Actually, tell about each other. Okay, don't talk about yourself, Austin, and talk about Johnny and so on. You probably spend more time with each other than your spouses if you're married. How did you stick together for so long? And when did you start the company?
Well, I'm going to kick this over to Austin and let him unwind this first, just to pass the ball and get the round the horn stuff going.
Yeah, so we came out of Duncan Callaway's Energy and Resources 254 course in 2012, it was fall of 2012. And it was actually a course that Johnny had recommended I take because I had expressed some interest in microgrids. And that was the point at which I met Jalel. And one of the pieces of that course was a capstone project that turned out Jalel and I both had a common interest in microgrids. And he had some existing connections in Vietnam. So we found a community in rural Vietnam in the Mekong Delta, where he had worked with a group previously. And we found this community of roughly about 1,500 individuals, none of whom had formal grid services. And we formulated this capstone project that essentially was intended to be a microgrid that was going to serve the entire population. So that was the point in which Jalel and I first met. And when we submitted that project and the course came to a close, I think both of us had a realization that we wanted to convert that into something more than just words on paper.
What year was this? And this is at UC Berkeley, right?
Yeah, this is at UC Berkeley, and this was the fall of 2012. So I was in my senior year of undergrad, and Jalel was in your fourth year, Jalel? Fifth year of Ph.D.?
Oh boy. Yeah, you lose count at a certain point. I was doing my qualifying exams, so it must have been my fourth year. And the course I took was sort of for fun while I was getting ready for my qualifying exams. This was the fun tinkering piece.
And it was the point at which he met an overly enthusiastic undergrad that wanted to just bug him every couple weeks to see what we could do to actually formulate this into something real. So not long thereafter, we started CRAY, which was Southeast Asia Renewable and Adaptive Energy, which was a research group that we had sort of intended to focus on broader technology and specifically microgrid questions in Southeast Asia. And that was hosted through the Energy and Resources group at UC Berkeley. We eventually realized that we needed some more conventional technical chops, engineering chops. And I have known Johnny since earlier in undergrad and ultimately realized that he would be a pretty fantastic addition to this growing team. And we reached out to him and told him that we were interested in doing this project in Vietnam, and pretty quickly became clear that he was going to be a fantastic fit.
Awesome. And what were the roles you decided to play in the company from that point? What was Jalal's role in there? Austin, you can tell about Jalel, and Jalel probably will talk about Johnny, and Johnny can talk about Austin.
So Jalel was, of course, the guy that kind of had an overarching vision as to how we were going to execute. And he, of course, had experience in Vietnam as well. So that was a critical piece. He had a number of years of experience in the field working in developing context. So that was also critical to sort of bringing us back down to earth in terms of what was actually feasible and the challenges that we were apt to face in building infrastructure in a developing context. So Jalel was really crucial in formulating relationships with both academic partners at UC Berkeley and beyond, and then also with the various government entities that were critical to gaining approvals in Vietnam, and also with the local execution teams that were going to be responsible for overseeing local labor forces and things along those lines. But at this point, it was still very much a research project. And it was the sort of thing where we didn't have any sort of funding to actually visit these locations. So we had to pretty quickly turn to grants. And it was the summer of 2013 when we started to officially look towards grants. And we had most immediate success with the UN Seed Award grant that ultimately gave us an initial burst of funding to go visit the site and kind of formulate an on-the-ground assessment of what the microgrid actually was going to look like. And we did that in the fall of 2013.
Awesome. Jalal, you want to talk about Johnny?
Yeah, let me weave Johnny and give a little flavor and fill in some of the cracks. So Johnny came in, and it must have been, oh boy, the late 2013. Johnny's very, very smart. So Johnny looked to make sure we had money for the tickets, and we were actually had won an award or something. And he was like, okay, this is real. He's clever. And so he came with us to Vietnam, I think, early in 2014. They had taken us, at that time, we were close or had secured some early finance to do the microgrid, or maybe this was the feasibility.
You already a company at that point?
We weren't a company. We formed when we came back from Vietnam. So Vietnam was quite a trip. This was our first trip, the three of us, I think, and we went internationally to do kind of a survey of the island and check it out. And it was funded partially by the UN and the German Ministry for the Environment, ICI, I think it's called. And that was useful. And then I think we also had some funds from Development Impact Lab at Berkeley, which came from USAID. So we kind of pulled those together to do this early bit, leveraging off those very early funds from Berkeley's Energy Resources Collaborative. And so this is, you're getting toward a year and a half into since Austin and I had met in the class, and we've been doing iterations. I think we did the survey with Jonathan in early 2014, and Jonathan had some experience doing off-grid solar in Nicaragua earlier in his career, and maybe also Madagascar. So he had done a few projects like this, and that sort of provided an essential, another type of reality check on what we were going to be doing and how we were going to be doing it. So we went out there in early 2014, had an interesting 2 or 3 week stint out there, came back, and then that's when we incorporated at New Sun Road. It was the three of us with, I think the roles as they're sort of being laid out here. That was the very beginning.
Awesome.
I think the actual formulation came about in the back of a cab in Hanoi, as I recall, when we all realized that we really needed to become a proper corporation in order for this to be a viable exercise.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we were a nonprofit. We were founded as kind of a nonprofit. We kind of started with this idea that we would get people solar systems and energy access in Vietnam and things as a nonprofit. Trick is, in Vietnam, it's actually easier to do work like that if you're a private company. And so hence New Sun Road was roughly born in the back of a cab in Hanoi.
Johnny, what is behind the name New Sun Road? And tell us about Austin. Why Austin? And Jalal.
The name, if I remember correctly, came from a dream of Jalal's. I don't remember when he had this one, but I think maybe it was we were in the cabin. He said, "What do you guys think about the name New Sun Road?" We're like, okay. It's got a kind of Eastern sound to it. It seemed appropriate for working in Vietnam. And he was talking about having this dream of, I think it was like a highway powered by solar energy type thing. There was more to it than that. And maybe if Jalal, you want to add a couple comments to the story behind the name, because it really came from him.
Yeah, good memory. It's in April of 2012. I had this series of dreams about using U.S. public infrastructure as kind of solar conduits for power, for one thing, like highways and such, and repurposing them. But it was kind of secondary to this idea of, it was swappable batteries, solar charging station program for Vietnam. So you're looking at like a better place for Vietnamese motorbikes, where people can drive their motorbikes in, choose a battery out from a bank of solar charged batteries, and go on their way. And the stations are beautiful. And New Sun Road was kind of I like the ring of it, because it was, it sounded like a noodle shop on Mount Fuji or something, of which there is one if you climb to the top of Mount Fuji. So it worked. And then a year and a half later, when we decided to do this, or even almost 2 years, it kind of was there. And we actually had an alternative name for a nonprofit that we started up. I think it was Global Community Power. And so we had two entities in the beginning, but the Global Community Power kind of didn't get as much attention as the New Sun Road.
Awesome. So what was Austin's role in this whole startup business?
I mean, initially it was kind of Austin who brought us all together. I think, as he kind of hinted, he and I were friends from early in college, and I had kind of been staying in touch with him about what he was, his interest in microgrids, because that was really my core focus as an undergrad. Yeah, we were on the Cal ski team at UC Berkeley together. I think it was after Austin had graduated, he had come up to visit Berkeley, and I was asking him, like, how are things going with that project that you were working on? He's like, well, we actually got a grant and, we need to do something. And I was like, okay. I was like, I'm about to graduate, and had decided I'd saved up a little bit of money working as a software engineering consultant, kind of part-time on the side during my undergrad. So I was like, I'm not going to seek a job that will pay me anything for a year or so. And my other dream was that I wanted to go live in a ski town, which Austin also wanted to do. So we actually, in this December 2013, moved out to Jackson, Wyoming from Berkeley. And I kind of recall I do remember working on our initial site survey in the car on Interstate 80 out there while Austin was driving, so that we could get ready to do our trip in 2014. I think the best way to describe Austin is probably to start with the vehicles that he drives. So he actually now has made his own electric vehicle.
Wow.
He's converted one and has even some new center hardware that he's put in. So Austin's kind of your ultimate tinkerer, and he soon earned the nickname Tether, I think, on our surveys in Vietnam, because despite my skills with electrical systems, I have very little patience for smartphone apps. And so I was always relying on Austin to hotspot us and run the survey technology that we were using to do these site surveys. So he's got a great attention to detail, and that kind of basically brought him into a role of running all of our networks and hardware, communication networks and hardware development. So yeah, Austin he's an environmental science undergrad, and early on went back and got some more IT and networking education on the side. So very, very skilled, self-taught hobbyist guy that can pretty much do anything.
Awesome. The reason I'm asking this question is because co-founder chemistry is hard. A lot of teams fall apart, and I'm trying to capture some of these stories about how successful companies have been built with good teams. What was that first product that you had to build, and where is it now in terms of the company?
The first product we built was actually a microgrid, a solar-powered microgrid of about 8 kilowatts, maybe 2, 3, 4 tons of material, more than that, 5 tons. What we did was we spec'd out a solar microgrid, a solution for an island in Vietnam. And then when that project, as we discussed, we went to survey it in 2014. I went back a few times to try to develop it with the government. And fast forward to the summer of 2014, we attended a UN ceremony for getting the award, which we got from the UN Undersecretary General or something like that, Akam Steiner, I think, in Nairobi. At that time, we met someone who was from Uganda, a man called Andrew Satango, who said, hey, we need solar power on these fishing islands in Lake Victoria. So these microgrid things that work out there too. And we said, okay, well, that's interesting. Back burner, because we were focused on Vietnam, which eventually fell through for various kind of political, not ready types of things. Regulatory happens all the time. So we had to quickly pivot, and we had started doing surveys. Jonathan had put together a survey with Austin for the Uganda project. He had, I believe, went out there. I think we sent him out there in the fall of 2014. Is that right, John?
Yeah, it's December. Yeah.
Right. So meanwhile, we're iterating the design of the systems. These guys are in Jackson Hole, enjoying the heck out of things. I was struggling and losing a pound of flesh to my Ph.D. in teaching undergrads at Berkeley and grad students. And we did a second iteration. We spent most of the time in my apartment in Oakland, which is the headquarters of New Sun Road, for the first 3 or 4 years up there. And we did a lot of deep design, what could go wrong, how to do this, endless iterations, and just gaming. I think that was the strongest part of our process. The 3 of us just sitting up there, and we do 2 or 3 day sessions. They would visit from Jackson Hole, or they'd be around, and we got a lot of work done. And we got to the field. We were ready for a lot of things, and we thought through to level 2, 3, 4 when we had to put this quite complex system in Uganda, which is where we pivoted after Jonathan did the survey in Uganda. We said, okay, we got to build something. It's 2.5 years we've been working on this. So we pulled the trigger in the spring of 15. I got my Ph.D. and we went out and built it. We camped on an island in Lake Victoria and we put this thing together, and there was a lot more to it. Jonathan and Austin spent time pressing steel on Jonathan's grandfather's farm and drilling and probably injuring themselves terribly for creating long-term disability things with these pieces of really heavy steel. And then we popped everything into a shipping container. I can say that because I wasn't there that day, so popped sounds right to me. And then shipped it across, and we installed it over 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks there, with Jonathan being there the longest, and just worked. That was our first product. And maybe before I talk about pivot, it was an island, Uganda fishing village, about 1,000, 1,500 people in the big season. We lit up like their main street with maybe 20 connections, 8 kilowatts of power. And before they had just had a big diesel generator that ran a few hours a day and lines coming off it. So it was a pretty popular first product. The great thing about it was a lot of the network engineering that Austin did allowed us to not only have a fantastic power system, which was really Johnny's bailiwick, but also to have real-time data coming off of it. So this is a lot more than smartphone maps. Like, we had controllable circuits in that first system that we kind of knocked together out of available stuff at the time. So we could control individual connections on that microgrid in Lake Victoria at 5-second, 10-second intervals from our phone with real-time data, which was pretty cool back in 2015. And so that was our first product. And eventually we scraped that technology off. But that's how I think of our first product of about 2.5 years of iteration and one major continental shift from Asia to Africa.
And you're still working off of grants at this point?
To build that first system, we had some kind of friends and family equity that came in. Once we had the drawings and the rights to do it, and we done our thing, we raised the money to build it in Asia, in Vietnam. And then when that went south, our friends and family investors were kind enough to let us hold on to it and do it in Uganda with this fellow we'd met at the UN meeting.
Okay, we'll come back to the funding a little later, but Austin, maybe you can talk about Stellar Microgrid, what the pivot was about, and the Stellar Edge, and whatever you have at this point. Like, what's that evolution like?
Yeah, I think it's most appropriate to kind of pick up directly where Jalel left off. So we hacked together this system for remote monitoring, and ultimately it was 3 of us who were not living in country. We were all based in California, and we had just built this asset. And as Jalel sort of highlighted at the top, one of the biggest complexities in building infrastructure in these types of locations is remote management and just general maintenance of the physical system after it's been constructed. So we were pretty convinced that we needed to have real-time monitoring and control capabilities. So we built a collection of local devices that could control circuits, as Jalel was mentioning, in real time through internet-enabled sockets, essentially, power sockets. And Johnny, in large part, built a software dashboard that would later evolve into Stellar Microgrid OS for visualizing both the generation from the solar panels and the consumption from the collective circuits that we were powering, so that we could see the sort of balance of system in real time and do load shedding and eventually understand how day ahead weather forecasts would impact the amount of solar we were getting. It got pretty complex pretty quickly, and we started to realize the power of the technology that we were building for this very specific and, quite frankly, small system in Uganda. It became clear that there was a lot of potential to use that in a number of other locations where people had been venturing to build the actual physical assets and in all likelihood gotten pretty good at it. But it didn't seem like there was a really effective management and control platform out of the box. So it seemed like there was a pretty good opportunity for us to potentially fill that void in the market.
Interesting. John, remote controlling was a problem and you overcame that in the product evolution. What was the next evolution like? That was your remote controlling of power generation. Is that the Stellar Edge smart device controller you're talking about?
So at that point, it was long before we'd really come up with a formal set of terminology around these systems. It was off-the-shelf devices from third-party vendors that were sort of reconfigured in such a way that they would serve our purposes, but it was decidedly not what they were designed to do. We after some period of time, started to realize that there was a lot of opportunities for us to build our own devices that would more specifically cater to exactly what it was that we were doing, that had adaptations to the complex environments where these things were being deployed, abilities to withstand periodic internet outages, which is sort of the name of the game in remote locations, and functionality to withstand extreme salinity and humidity and the conditions that you usually find in island systems, which is often where you are not going to be well serviced by traditional grids. So that was sort of the kernel around which the idea for the hardware device that would later evolve into Stellar Edge came from, I would say.
Johnny, maybe you can talk about that evolution process of building your own products. What does that transition look like? And tell us about the complexity.
Sure, yeah. I'd be remiss also not to add that our first version did in fact take place in Austin's mom's garage of the Stellar Edge devices. So we do have that feather in our cap there. But yeah, so the first hardware that we designed was kind of hacked together from different bits, mainly to act as electricity meters in a much more economical way. And then what we did with Stellar Microgrid Operating System was get systems from different vendors to talk to each other and kind of act together in a seamless and unified way. So the next step that we needed to do for that was we were kind of constrained by systems that already had hardware that already had a backend that could send information up to the cloud. So we started looking at building what is now the Stellar Edge device that's just its own circuit board that we custom designed that we can install and can basically talk to any smart piece of hardware in a microgrid. And when we started doing that was when I think we really relied a lot on some support we got from Microsoft Corporation. They funded us with a small grant, but probably more importantly, had a product development program that went along with it. And I think this was at the same time that we were in the citrus foundry as well. So things were really kind of starting to pick up a lot then on really visioning what our products would look like and how we were going to mature as a company from kind of going through our first prototype. So we spent a couple weeks up in Microsoft's facility in Redmond. They had a really good team that worked with us on our hardware prototyping, and we kind of came out of that with a new product, basically. That was, I think at that point, we called it SolSense, but it's now called Stellar Edge.
Awesome. We'll come back to this partnership with Microsoft a little later. But Jalal, most of the listeners are in the US. I don't think they have an appreciation for how complex or different, or for that matter, dysfunctional the markets in Uganda or Vietnam might be. So it could range from not knowing the local language to not understanding the culture, lack of infrastructure. I'm fascinated by how you missionaries stuck to it and overcame the problem. So give us a sense of the complexities that you had to go through. You said you're in over 20 countries and developing or poor nations at this point.
Yeah, that's true to a point. We are now arguably our biggest market, or maybe the biggest component of our revenue is the US. So in the last couple of years, we've seen the US actually starting to embrace remote management for solar and things, because you have a lot of need for resilience in infrastructure and energy. And that's what we do. We've been working on creating resilience because we're building these systems in challenging environments, and we need to keep them alive and operating autonomously in difficult places where it's expensive to reach. That's really our bread and butter. That's what we learned to do in Uganda. So a lot of our mission drives us in a lot of ways toward developing countries, but the whole world has a challenge right now with resilience of different kinds. You have people in the US who don't have access to reliable power now, and in some parts of California when it's shut off, which can be deadly for some people. And certainly internet access is not solved here. That said, the way we got out into these places, there's a set of long stories. I've been personally working in development since about 2005 or 6, I guess. I set up the Vietnam Green Building Council in Hanoi, Vietnam, and lived there for 3 years prior to coming back to Berkeley to do my Ph.D. And I was just always interested in global issues and issues of equity in developing countries. So the Vietnam Building Council, from my perspective, was similar in that we were trying to push technology out to places that weren't necessarily ready, it's a bit of a leapfrog going on. We certified green buildings. We wrote the first green building standards for Vietnam at the Green Building Council, and for the world's first credit for climate change adaptation, as far as I know. And that laid the groundwork for the first project we had, which eventually we did not build in Vietnam. But that's where all those tracks were laid, and those relationships with folks in Vietnam were made. And then the pivot to Africa, likewise, was an opportunity born of traveling, in this case to Kenya, to this event where we met folks there. And we set up a very deep relationship with East Africa that we still have to this day. So I go there 3, 4, 5 times a year pre-COVID. And I think that all of us have the drive to go out into the far corners from our limited vantage point of the world and try to bring things to folks that, not without sounding hokey or aw shucks about it, we feel like they should have. We've all sort of had these feelings where we can light up a school and it's a very genuine feeling of achievement and accomplishment. And we like to travel, and we're in our earlier days before I had children, we were pretty adventurous. So we'd go camp on an island in Uganda, and we were okay going to a place with no running water or electricity or roads. So I think it's a mixture of those things, really wanting to make a global impact. We see this as a global problem. Climate change is a global problem, equity. And we've always kind of been careful not to spread ourselves too thin, but do as much as we can around the world. And I think that now we've ended up here at the US, and we have a chance to go back and retrench some of our foreign markets and really work from a position of strength here in the US.
That's fascinating. So much of the world needs basic things like electricity and internet at this point. Austin, give us a sense of the reality going from US to an under-resourced country like Vietnam or Uganda. Let us zoom into the very first country, or maybe Uganda for that matter. Describe in some detail how different it looked from developing a project in the US. Walk us through a typical process. I don't know if there's a process called typical, but from the first time you approach them or they approach you to installing and getting it up and running. Give some perspective for somebody who's trying to do a similar project or start a company, do a similar project in other countries. I want to give that perspective and help them as well. Where do you start?
So I think the most critical piece to really having a successful project in those types of contexts is effective local partnerships, working with individuals that know the appropriate government and political and logistical pipelines that you have to navigate in order to really see a system from design to commissioning and beyond. In the case of Uganda, for us, it was a pretty expedited project. And as was mentioned previously, we designed the entirety of the system in California and actually built much of it here as well, pre-assembled and containerized it. And then it traveled much of the way around the planet to land in the African continent. Then it took an overland journey and then eventually was removed from a container after a fair bit of logistical hassle. And individually, components were moved from this container into what looks like a large canoe by my assessment of it. And these batteries and panels and things along those lines were hand transported by individuals from this boat to the island. And the island, to paint a picture, was completely devoid of roads, completely devoid of cars. I think there was one moped on the entire island. And it was a fishing community. So much of the community that lived there was at sea during the day. And the businesses that were actually on Main Street, as we called it, were businesses that catered to fishing folks. So it was really just understanding how power was going to be used and picking the most appropriate places to start the initial microgrid and expanding there on out. But it was not the sort of circumstance where you can go out and expect to find any sort of hardware that you would at Home Depot. It's a vastly more complex thing that requires a lot of additional assessment before you put inside of a box, because once you're in country, you're sort of expecting prolonged lead times to fill any sort of gaps that you might experience in your planning.
Wow. Before I go to Johnny, Jalal, you mentioned about something being stolen.
I don't know if by that point we'd had anything stolen. So we had some mishaps. We can be real about this. Like, I think folks who are trying to do this at home, going out to try to build power systems and islands without any infrastructure 10,000 miles away. I mean, the first thing is you get your butt kicked. You're going to get your butt kicked every single day with everything you have to do. And it's a really bad idea. You should think twice about doing it. It's a really bad idea. Like, what you need is just grit to hang on every day, because every day something is good. Like, we learned that there was just going to be some sort of fire every day from shipping. And Austin is exactly right. In giant canoe, we went from a shipping container to a truck, and then at the docks it was literally called the Ark. It was a wooden boat of about 30 feet called the Ark. They hand loaded 4 or 5 tons of equipment in, including batteries and panels. And then we got to the island and people carried them ashore through water. They waited with the panels over the head. Johnny had to be carried to the boat and cut the batteries apart to get them. I mean, it was like every day there was a new kind of challenge. And that was not just material and physical, but we're eating different foods. We don't have sanitation. I mean, these are the challenges folks there are putting up with all the time, but it makes it sometimes difficult to build. And then the regulatory stuff. When Austin says we had some mishaps with customs, he means I ended up standing in like a silent, quiet protest for about 5 hours in front of someone's desk so they'd finally release our shipment. Those kind of things happen every day. And in Uganda, but both of our first early sites, we ended up ultimately not being successful. Those were not successful. So I think the lesson is, if you go out to do something like this, you better be doing something that can be transferred. And think of it as experiment where you're going to fail and develop out of all this arose the technology that we have now to meet those problems, but giving birth to it, such as it were, where it was extremely painful all the way through. And this first product was not quite stolen. I think this is what you might mean, that we eventually decommissioned the microgrid on Uganda, where we'd had all this technical success and great success with the people there because of some regulatory issues. And just leave it there for purposes of this podcast.
Huh. Well, the reason I was laughing was not because of the mishap. I think, Jalal, you and I were talking about it. I think I came back, I was running my startup, came back from India, had similar experiences. And like, maybe Johnny, you can talk about the transportation logistics, building anything in your grandfather's garage or Austin's mom's garage, and then moving things around the world. Give us a sense. I've gone through this. I think people need to have an idea of like what they're walking into.
Yeah. The fact that they're on metric system versus imperial and like different electrical standards and all that makes it also very difficult, because things that I would want to get here in the United States to ship over can't get here easily. And it's very hard to figure out what you can get locally. So that kind of stuff takes time. I think when we were first doing it, I was constantly surprised. Something that I would totally expect they would have like certain type of electrical conduit or something like that. I'm like, I got to be able to find it. Can't find it anywhere. And then I turn around and I'm out on the islands and somebody's got a welder hooked up to a generator. I'm like, oh, I guess we maybe could have used a welder to do this thing, where I had like planned this elaborate solution for how we were going to set something up. So that, having done this for a few years now, that's gotten a bit easier, but it's still like whenever we're getting ready for a build, it's like the lists are just my nightmare. Every little piece of hardware, nut, washer, getting all of that together, have to have an attention to detail and just go over things again and again. And this kind of goes back to our funding a little bit. And I think part of our DNA, I guess, as a company is that we were doing everything very frugally too. So we weren't on a big cushy grant to do this project, which I think actually played a big role in us developing innovative hardware, because we had to come up against these constraints. But I couldn't just pack extra everything. I had to be very selective of what I would bring for just in case, or what just the budget couldn't afford. So it had to be very, very close. So yeah, if you're doing it at home, it helps to have a big budget, or it helps to work with another firm that can kind of put the whole microgrid together for you. But when we started looking at doing that, we realized that the economics just weren't going to work out that way unless we started from the bottom up and relied as much as we could on what was local.
Yeah, you need a lot of grit and extreme planning.
You have to push really hard. That was something that I think was challenging too. When you're working somewhere and you're dealing with a different culture, and you're trying to do something that's daunting. It's like you have to constantly be pushing, and you'll find that some people are really great to work with and some people can be a thorn in your side. And it's not always easy. Like, I think for our first project, it was hard for us to times figure out how to navigate some of that stuff personally. And I think Jalel was really, really great at a lot of that stuff. And it's kind of part of why he's our CEO as well, is because he has quite a bit of empathy and reads people very well. So I was always very happy when I could focus on the electric power system, and Jalel was getting the right people around to help me. When he wasn't around, it was very frustrating for me.
I can completely understand. Maybe Jalal, maybe you can talk about like, what does help look like on the ground? If there are 2 or 3 people that were like really helpful, and if I'm trying to find a local champion, if I'm trying to start a company in these countries, build something there, what worked in getting help?
So first I want to say, like, it is difficult to do this. Like, you need grit, like you just said, but it's crucially important, I think, for young companies to go out and do the hardest thing and throw yourself into something. Because once we had done this project, we had a calling card and we had done something and we had the experience, and that's fed this company. That got us the relationship with Microsoft because we could point to the system we built. Against all odds, it worked, and it worked very well. And we still do the same thing today. Jonathan just put in with his team down in Guatemala in September, 10 power systems in 10 days in the highlands of Guatemala. It took us 2 months to do the build for the first one. We did 10 of them in 10 days in September. So we've distilled that over time. We have support teams now. We have subsidiaries in Guatemala. Definitely, it's not just the 3 of us bending away anymore. But that first experience has guided a lot of what we do. A lot of it is tested against what we learned in the field and how hard that was. And in terms of finding local help and dealing with the people there, it's a really good question. I think you have to trust people sometimes. I think there's a certain amount of, you can push people your way, but there's a point where you can't break things because you're relying on this network or ecosystem in this place that maybe you're not so familiar with. And I don't know if it's trust or just a sort of resignation at some point. And you say, I'm getting in this truck. I mean, you try to hedge your bets as well as you can and hold what leverage you can. We had a tough experience in Uganda in a lot of ways, aside from the build itself, which I think the main thing is just to try to understand where resources can come from of whatever kind, whether it's medical or food or technical, whatever it is, and just have those ready. Like anyone does, it's kind of second nature for us to build ecosystems around us. And we had to do that for technical enterprise that was very risky and very difficult. And I think we've always tried to replicate that a bit in our field events. And even as a company, and we try to solve problems in the same way. We look around to each other. We look around to people we know. We do a lot based on that sort of ecosystem. Even the company has grown in a very sort of organic way through friendships and people we feel like we can depend on and trust. So from this core, we've added a fair amount of acquaintances, and it's built a very strong base for the company.
Basically, you built a lot of good relationships over a period of time.
Yeah. And I think good relationships that I can depend on Jonathan to count every bolt and every nut, except for that one drill bit in Uganda, which that's a different story. But I'll say it's extraordinary that this worked in one ship, and I can count on Austin to get us internet anywhere in the world. In Uganda, he was forever like, you'd look around and where's Austin? He'd be like at the top of a ladder, leaned against a pole, trying to get a signal so we could all get our daily work done or something like that. So,
wow, love the team.
Well, the team, and yeah, it's an ethos, but I guess it's just being resourceful is the thing.
Awesome. Let's like to shift gears. Austin, maybe you can talk about this. What are the incubator programs or anything else that helped you get this far from the idea stage? It was a class at UC Berkeley. If you can walk us through the program that really helped.
At least from my perspective, the single most effective incubator was really the Citrus Foundry. I mean, I benefited tremendously from having access to the invention lab in the bottom of Satarjadai. As I was mentioning previously, a lot of the early work that we did around formulating the SolSense hardware line that would later become the Stellar Edge hardware line was formulated during that year-long program. And I was working closely with a lot of other individuals who had more expertise than I in circuit board design. And there was just a lot of osmosis and general best practices around using various prototyping equipment, philosophies around iterative design and failing quickly. It was a really, really effective way for me to learn a great deal around using microcontrollers and various rapid prototyping techniques to really build products that fit the specific needs of what we were trying to do and really make that quantum jump from using off-the-shelf products to actually having a device that was custom built for our applications and would solve a lot of the problems that we had experienced in the field. So that was the technical side. And there was a lot of weekly meetings on more of the business development and just general company direction conversations that would happen in those meetings on the sixth floor. And I did find those to be pretty effective. And it was just interesting to be around other people that were in the same stages, or in some cases further along, to really get a sense of best practices. And beyond that, even just to hear like genuine stories of other people struggling with either familiar issues or issues that were totally far flung, but just to have some sense that other people hadn't really quite figured it out and were still kind of just nailing in exactly what it was that they were trying to do to get traction and make it work.
I was in the same cohort, and the one company I could relate was yours at that point, building the product and trying to deal with bureaucracy in India at that point.
Totally.
Well, thank you for that. And Jalel, can you walk us through the partnerships you've built so far? I see that Microsoft is a strategic partner. How did you end up working with them, and how did they support you? I think Austin mentioned briefly about how they helped you with the hardware.
Yeah, they've been crucially important. And I think the two important ones are the one with UC Berkeley. Now, the Citrus Foundry, which is the Berkeley incubator for those where we met Naresh, was my best too. So that one was, I think that was foundational to launching our partnership with Microsoft, because we were in there, we had built our first system. Austin's tinkering away in the basement. Jonathan's up doing power system design, and their Maker Lab was great. We had the conference room. And then so when Microsoft kind of came to check us out and see what we were doing for this thing called the Affordable Access Initiative in 2016, we had a setting. It wasn't my apartment in Oakland, which would have been a different thing because my small dog barks a lot and things like that. So we had a nice boardroom we could take them to. We had some facilities we could show them. What happened with Microsoft was, so for context, we had built the Uganda system in 2015 in the summer. It worked really well. We'd made some alterations, gone back in the fall to deal with demand that was already rising with the system. Jonathan did some brilliant engineering from afar, I think, in some parts to sort of allow the system to be upgraded. And then we ran into those said regulatory issues, and we realized we were going to have to do something different. Luckily, at that time, I think Austin had found this. We were still looking for grants at the time, even though we had some equity, friends and family type stuff. Austin had found a Microsoft grant for providing internet access to folks. And because we were doing that, that's part of the story here. Austin had built such a great network for our first power system that we actually put in Wi-Fi access points. We're like, why not? Let's do it. Let's serve Wi-Fi. And Microsoft thought that was pretty cool. And so most of the companies that they had in their first cohort for affordable access were like ISPs or connectivity plays. And in places like India with educational connectivity, we were the only energy company because we were doing both of these things. So we got a grant of about $75,000 from them. And we started this relationship, which is half a decade old now, with some key people there in their technology and corporate social responsibility group, what's called the Airband group now. So we got this grant, which was really useful for us. We went back out. And at the same time, we realized we had to do something different with this power system in Uganda because we weren't going to be able to deliver power to our customers because of the issues. So around that time, I thought, hey, let's just cut the power lines and just have a centralized place where we can serve power. So there were two key moves around that time. One was starting to go focusing on software, which is something Jonathan especially had been talking about since the beginning because he had that experience in software. And we'd long kind of talked about a design tool, operation tool called something to manage microgrids. But with Microsoft coming in, with Citrus Foundry telling us we should focus on technology and scale rather than just building projects, and with our first on-the-ground project kind of in nebulous waters in terms of its operational future, we said, hey, let's work on software. So that was our pitch to Microsoft. We're going to build software for control of remote power systems and microgrids. And we also went back in the summer. I think I went in the summer when we were getting the grant with some of their grant, and I transformed our power station Uganda into a center. We called it the Kitobo Information Collaborative, where people could come. I brought some tablets. We cut into it, opened it up, made it a kiosk. And that power system became used for informational services, and people could come charge their phones. They could come learn, get tablet lessons. Local pharmacists could come and look up medicines. We provided a different set of services based on the regulatory blockades that have been thrown against us for rather unfair reasons. That line of business is something we're doing a lot of now. These power systems in Guatemala, these digital literacy centers, we call them now. We're doing them with Microsoft, with the vice president's office in the US through the Central American Partnership. And it's something we really believe in. And then the software, the Stellar Microgrid OS and the Stellar Edge, think of it all as the IoT system, started growing with that Microsoft grant. So really that's where we launched on the two business lines writ large that we're working on today. And also our technical team set up half a dozen joint sprints over maybe 3 or 4 years in Redmond with what they called the IoT Insider Lab, where we would accelerate our IoT development, send up 3, 4, 5 engineers. One time we drove up 6 engineers and just get to work. And we got our products out faster, especially our hardware devices. We were able to really punch above our weight with Austin kind of leading the charge and leveraging what the deep expertise there. And that's been a big relationship. Microsoft has since become an investor. They made some subsequent grants in climate, and now we do revenue share investments with them and have quite a close working partnership.
Nice. There's an important lesson in there, I think, rather than just working on projects. Like a lot of startups get caught up in that, working on that technology and scale. I think that's a big takeaway from your citrus experience, right?
Yeah. And that was Patrick Scaglia, who, Alec Chen was good on that. Peter Miner was good on that. But Patrick is really the one saying, hey, guys, projects are going to burn you out. Like, what's scalable here?
Yeah. And you spoke about regulatory hindrances. What were they about? What did they like?
Well, anywhere we went, this is something that feeds into the core of who we are as a technology company. We're based in the East Bay, Berkeley, Oakland, Richmond. Our offices are now in Richmond. I had done my time. I had spent a lot of time doing development work in country in Vietnam, built up an organization. None of us were really ready to move, but to be there, you really have to be on the ground in these places to navigate. And I think, Naresh, you can get that from your experience. And not only should you be there, but you really need to be involved in the day-to-day ecosystem of what people are doing there, the government. So in Vietnam, we aborted our first project because we ran into some situations with exorbitant prices being charged. And we just found that we were going to get into situations we felt were a little bit too close to questionable for us. So we aborted the project and went to Africa, to Uganda. And then our project in Uganda, the regulatory issues really were about us getting assurances from, and I don't want to go into bodies and so on that were involved, but this was great to do. And then there was a situation where we were maybe needed to do something we didn't want to do, and we decided it wasn't viable to keep going. The rules are different in different parts of the world, and I have very little to say about the way business works in different places around the world because it works the way it works there. However, I think it's good for people who are in those environments to manage those environments. And for us, we were not prepared to play and to be developers in Uganda. So we have partners now who do that. And we decided at that point to pull back and sell technology. In Uganda, when we were kind of boxed out of our territory that we were meant to have, that we'd been kind of assured we'd have, and that we did all the right regulatory steps to achieve, we just kind of said, well, that's too much. We're not prepared to go in and be developers. Let's develop technology, scrape it off. Here's Microsoft. They want us to develop a platform for energy access and internet access. Let's read the writing on the wall and just go in that direction. And that was the real fundamental pivot of the company.
Yeah, sometimes it's water on the bridge, but you learn a lot doing on the ground experiences.
You got to get beat up a little bit, right?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for sharing those lessons. And walk us through the funding journey of New Sun Road. From not having any money, I don't know where you guys are with your fundraising cycle at this point. If you can give us how you steered through that landscape.
We've raised somewhere around $4.5 million total in the history of the company. There's two distinct phases. It started with these kind of trickle of grants. And the first thing I said early with Austin, I had done some fundraising before with the Vietnam Green Building Council and stuff. And I told Austin, you get a little bit money and that leads to a little bit more and then you get a little bit more. And that was the game plan. Our first money in the company was $800 from the Berkeley Energy and Resource Collaborative, which was for pizzas. And I think maybe I sent Austin a check in his early undergraduate age so he could cover a dongle or something. It's nothing. Then we got about 10K. So we went up one order of magnitude from these grants. And then we got the friends and family stuff, which took us to a new level. That was like on the order of 250,000 to build the systems. And that was significant. That's when things kind of got a little real because they're like, oh my God, we're going to have to like pay people back or just tell them we can't. And so that was a tremendous weight that we took on our collective shoulders. And then once you get past that, then you get to the Microsoft grants. And not just the first one, but in 2017, I can talk about this now. We got another grant from Microsoft of like 350,000 or something, and another like 330 from Facebook, which was an early kind of funder of our platform as well. And so that was an influx of money into the company. All of a sudden we had like $1 million almost running through the company in 2017. And I was nervous as heck because we brought in people. We brought in a second wave of founders, our colleagues, Michael Goldbach, Farhad Farzana. A little bit later, Michael Cohen came in. We had this kind of second wave of actually folks with more mid-career industry experience. I had no idea how we were going to keep them on, but we made it through 2017 with this grant cycle. And then, like Austin said, we met Skyview Ventures, which was our earliest convertible seed funder. We put a seed round about $700,000 together in 2018. And then we got a little bit more money, I think, from Facebook to go with that year. So we had about $1 million budget in 2018. 2019, we did more seed funding, did another $500,000-$600,000 that year. And then in 2020, I think we did one more note. And then we got about $1 million in revenue share investment from Microsoft. So we're looking at about $4.5 million in grants and notes and revenue share, with Microsoft and Skyview being our biggest investors. And like Austin said, especially over the last 18 months, our revenues for the first time pushed up over $1 million this last year. We're starting to see some contribution margin that's significant to the company in terms of keeping its operations going. And profitability is not a crazy idea for us. And so we've managed there, and we're raising currently an $8 million Series A round is what we're on now. And we're doing pretty well. We have a strategic partner for that. And with the growth we've seen and the position the company is in these days, we're pretty confident that we'll get there.
Congratulations on that. It's phenomenal, not taking too much money and get to that revenue. It should be a nice goal for a lot of founders rather than raising a lot of money.
We were never in it really to raise money. In fact, it's funny. We just have a different trajectory and a different thing that motors the company. And so the Series A, B, C, D thing works for us in a way because we think that what we can do is scalable. We think our engineering's as good as it gets anywhere in the world for what we do. I wouldn't trade our core engineering team, including my co-founders, for anything because the way the company's cohered. And so it's the right time, but it's for us the right mechanism of doing what we want to do to spread it. We didn't come into it to get to Series D or to grab the unicorn by the tail or whatever people say these days. It's kind of just the mechanisms that are available to us. And we've had an unconventional, I think, path, and we'll probably continue to have some unconventional paths, but it's worked for us.
Wonderful. That was one of the reasons I wanted to have you guys as the first speakers for my podcast this year, because that is a nice way to build a company. And this is kind of a startup where you don't make too much money. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm guessing you didn't come into the startup because you're trying to make money initially, at least, hopefully. But did you happen to talk to investors along this journey, any of the VCs? And what are the kinds of questions you were getting from them initially in the early stages? And if you're still talking to them, what are the kinds of questions you're getting now?
Yes, we've been talking to VCs for several years now through the seed and the early Series A raise. And we didn't get in it to make money. I don't think any of us did. I think there were better paths to making money, some different types of jobs and investments and things like that. The question I get from VCs ranges from how are you going to make me money, which is one I hear from time to time as an opening shot. And that's whatever you think, that's the question for VCs. How are you going to make me money? Where's my carry? If you're a $1 billion company, you have to make make me believe that you're going to be a $10 billion company. That's, to me, the whole heart of it. Now, there's impact investors, and there are different flavors. Some are increasingly, I'm told, impact first, but my experience with investors all our investors have been commercial investors. We've never taken money from an impact firm at this point. And I think it's important for any founders to remember it's that you believe in your product, you believe in your mission, you believe in your team. The investor believes in credible, concrete stories of how you get what your path is to $1 billion and their path to whatever it is, 40x or 50x. Early, we were not able to tell that story. It was hard to see. You can see 2 years ahead, maybe sometimes, but seeing 5 years ahead is very, very difficult. Now we can, I think, tell a better story about, we can break down and tell in pieces a story of how we can get to 100 million in revenue, how we can get to $1 billion in value, because we have enough of a foundation and we have enough tracks laid. We weren't about a single idea as a company. We didn't found it because, remote control cat toys. That's it. We weren't a one sentence company. We're a company that is based on relationships between people, common mission, rigorous engineering and testing of ideas. And it took a long time for us to sort of build on top of that, the revenue generating business that we have today and get in a position where we can lay that out for investors.
Yeah, this is a different kind of a business. Like, what does competition look like in this space for you guys?
It's diverse because we play in a lot of different segments. Our model is almost to have like a very good customer in a given segment. Like, for instance, our telco partner in Latin America, one of their premier energy services company for telecom towers. And our competition there is some legacy telecoms equipment providers. In these cases, we often are in nascent markets where there's older players trying to come in, or you have players that are a little bit younger than us, but the markets aren't fully fleshed out. In the US, in the microgrid space, there's a little bit more definition because we've come, as it were, late to the US market. We're 3-4 years into our company lifespan. So the companies we see in the US as competition are maybe a little bit older, but maybe they don't have the same on the ground practical experience we do as a whole stack company, from engineering one to all the way up to the cloud and software and AI. We see competition in a case by case basis, almost in our 3 or 4 biggest segments: US microgrids, African microgrids, and Latin American telecom. As we get bigger and better, it becomes more defined. Like, we see a lot of players coming into controls and microgrid controls in the US. We see older manufacturers starting to up their software game, like the inverter manufacturers, for instance. So it's certainly rigorous, but at the same time, it sometimes feels good to be able to point to like 3 or 4 companies that you're competing with most vigorously and know them, instead of not being able to really answer the question well.
I'm sure there's a lot of competition. I've done some research, so that's why I wanted to hear from you guys. Johnny, Austin, anything to add to that? How you see competition and how you stay ahead of them?
I suppose I can answer from the hardware perspective. The constant question that I ask myself in managing the development of the various hardware devices that we create is it worthwhile to build something new or buy something off the shelf? And it's a question that I have to ask myself with some regularity. And what I often find is that most of the devices that you can purchase off the shelf are usually tailored to environments in data centers, in more conventional, controlled, and climatically predictable environments. And in some cases, you end up paying, ironically, more for that than you would for something that you can build yourself that actually has a lot of the adaptations that allow it to withstand the difficult scenarios that these hybrid power systems are often going to be exposed to. But then there's, of course, the engineering time and all the logistics associated with bringing a new product to life. So we found ourselves in this place where we've kind of focused on the hardware controller and have really done everything that we can do to be as adaptable to all the different types of common communication protocols that we're using in the field. So rather than sort of locking it into a specific vendor or a specific type of communication protocol that is very narrow to one application, it has all of these rich peripherals that allow it to work with, at this point, hundreds of external types of devices. So it can be the sort of orchestrator of all the systems on the ground, as opposed to us having to build out this whole slew of different power electronics or sensors, things along those lines. It's rather just the sort of brain that sits in the middle that's able to communicate with it.
That's a nice segue into what's in store for the future. As you know, I'm a big cheerleader of startups like yours. It's tough to be in this business. Internally, I'm wondering if there's anything that scares you the most. What keeps you up at night? And where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are your goals? I know 5 years is too long, but maybe Jalel can probably give us a 2-year view.
Yeah, right. Thanks. No, things are changing a lot. What keeps me up and scares me? So I have a 2-year-old, 3-month daughter. Climate change is what keeps me up at night, and maybe political stability and so on. The old democracy, like that too. So I'm much more kept up by macro issues. Competition always keeps me a little nervous, but I think the company is coming into its own as a self-sustaining beast. Finally, that's been the biggest achievement of the last 12 to 18 months. So on that front, we execute, we raise, we have everyone that knows their beast, and we just have to roll with the punches. There's nothing worse than sitting in front of an electrical shop in downtown Kampala in 120-degree heat when you're sick and you haven't been fed properly or slept properly in 2 months and there's a thunderstorm coming. So we've seen a lot of stuff, and personally, it's the larger macro stuff that we continue to address that I think about the most.
Indeed. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that is critical in terms of what makes New Sun Road unique, whether it's the product or the team? If I've missed anything that you want to bring up.
For me, very quickly, we're a public benefit corporation. That hasn't come up. We're a different corporate form.
What is a public benefit corporation?
We have in our charter written in a mission to provide clean energy technology to emerging countries, provide energy access. So that's part of our corporate charter. It gives us some ability to pursue those missions within our fiduciary responsibilities. So it is a real thing. It's a legal standing. We've been a public benefit corporation since 2014. I think the most important thing for me that people often don't know is that we innovate just as much on the corporate side, on the organizational side, as we do on the technology side. And we fought to keep that designation of PBC. And we want to see more of that. And we'd love to be more involved in fostering other companies that would like to change things in that way.
Thank you for plugging that in. Austin, Johnny, do you have anything that I missed?
I'd just like to add just a shout out to the rest of the team at New Sun Road too. I mean, I think the impact of what we do globally is extremely important to me, that the people I work with on a daily basis. Coming from having just the three of us working together for a couple of years to now having a team of around 20 people who are just all really good people is a big part of what's making me happy to just have this be my job for the foreseeable future. I'd say probably even more so than having our success and growing as a company financially, it's just having an actual workplace that I like. And yeah, I hope that others are starting their own companies. We'll think about that carefully, because we hired very slowly, we hired very carefully, and sometimes felt like we were crawling along a growth path that was supposed to be a lot faster. But where we are now, I'm very thankful for it.
Thank you. Austin, maybe I'll steer you towards what was the most satisfying part of the startup journey? And I think I heard one of you say, I had my luckiest and nicest days in my professional career. I think in one of your interviews, it must be extremely rewarding for each of your souls doing this good work. Thank you for that. And if you can shed some light on the impact that you guys are happy and proud of.
Yeah, I think that, and this is something that's come up a number of times over the years when we're interviewing people and when we're discussing exactly what it is that we do with people that are not familiar. Being able to visit the field and actually understand the impact of the work, and visiting a power system and a community that's receiving electricity for the first time in any sort of reliable sense is, for me, what makes it all worth it. And it really kind of brings it home to understand exactly what people are capable of doing as soon as they're afforded this just basic resource by most external definitions. The progress that people are able to make isn't measured in years. It's usually measured in weeks. And oftentimes we'll go back some period of time after the initial installation of one of these systems and see the incredible business ventures or new offerings that existing businesses are able to make just in having this basic energy service. So that's the thing that really makes me feel good when I'm getting up in the morning, and it allows me to sort of transcend some of the other less exciting stuff around supply chain logistics and chip gates and all these other complexities that do periodically keep me up at night. It's nice to be able to always reflect upon that.
Thank you for that. And I think you guys are one of the most interesting startups doing some real work that actually changes lives. Thank you for all you guys are doing. And I want to move on to my traditional closing questions. What are the couple of lessons you learned in building New Sun Road? Maybe you can talk about any mistakes that others could avoid that you learned from.
My personal take is patience. I think that initially everything we were doing was just something that I wanted to happen immediately, and we weren't building systems fast enough or whatever it was. And I think as we enter the 9th year of this thing, it becomes a bit more appropriate to kind of look at longer term objectives and just be more content to recognize that some things take a bit of time to really reach the maturity and be comfortable in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, having just like last year hired our first legitimate business team and not doing 99.9% of the selling myself, I would say I maybe would have done that a little bit earlier, but we've put most of our resources into engineering over time. And I think that that has paid dividends as well. So I wouldn't have it any other way, but it has been nice having a full-on BD and experienced business end to keep the wheels of commerce moving as we do larger things and look toward the future. Maybe it goes toward balance. I think early founders, you want to make sure that you have the basic boxes checked, sales, marketing, and you can do the conventional stuff as well as the exciting tech stuff. Just you have a better chance of success, I think.
Nice. That's a hard thing, I guess. When to hire and when to build up and when not to do everything. As a founder, it's really hard. Yeah. And the next question is, are there one or two people that you want to identify who played a significant role in your startup journey?
I'm going to go first and I may have another one, but I'll say my wife, Susana Archea, has been a tremendous person for me. And especially like the last 4 or 5 years, she's been with me in every part. She's a really important contributor to the company in her own right as a manager of a lot of what we do on the ground. So I would be remiss in not thanking her and pointing her out as foundational for me.
Austin.
I'm going to call out one specific individual, which is a gentleman called Fuja Zhang, who was actually one of our very first hires. And he has continued to oversee all of our operations in China, which without his help, a lot of what we do in terms of building the effective and affordable hardware probably would be impossible. So he's weathered a lot of variable conditions on the ground, and I think has really done a tremendous job. So I'm super, super grateful for him.
Johnny.
Internally, I'd like to call out our Chief Product Officer, Michael Goldock, and Chief Technology Officer, Farhad Fajne, who, when they joined the company in 2016, 2017, it was really kind of a big turning point for us. And they've played a huge role in our success since then, as well as everybody else who's joined. And then personally, I think my grandparents and my mom. My grandparents, as we alluded to earlier, let us build some of our early stuff on their farm. And just when things were a little more meager in the early days, I never got any questions of, what are you doing here? And, there's just had a lot of faith and confidence in what we were doing. I don't think I would have been able to walk the journey without that. So.
Awesome.
One more to external. I want to thank Candace Eggers of Firelight Capital, who's been a huge advisor of ours, also just for the love of the company for many years, and investor. Kevin Connolly of Microsoft, who's been a tremendous supporter through the years, and friend of the company, Andy Koretsky and Greg Widrow, also, who've been huge supporters of the company. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize the people who got us through thick and thin.
Guys, it has been a pleasure talking to you about your startup journey. You're doing some very meaningful work, much needed to help some of the most neglected populations around the world. Thank you for the work and sharing the story, and good luck with your fundraising and future endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naresh. It's great to be with you.
Thanks for having us, Naresh. It's been a pleasure. Looking forward to it. Good luck with your show.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.